Hi, and welcome to the Reclamation Project podcast. We are so glad that you're here, that you're listening, and hopefully that you're a part of the conversation. Today, we are going to continue our discussion on love and relationship and marriage. And again, I just want to make this abundantly clear that wherever you're at, whether you're single or married or in a couple relationship or whether you have no romantic interest at all right now and you just have friendships and work relationships and things like that, wherever you are, what we are talking about, we feel can be utilized in any of those places. So while we are talking about marriage specifically and spouses and partners and all of that, feel free to interchange your situation, interchange those words with whatever your situation is. So instead of marriage, it could be boyfriend, girlfriend, or instead of marriage, it could be friendship or a coworker. Wherever you are, we just hope that you can take what we're talking about and apply it to your situation. As we continue this conversation, this discussion on love and relationships and marriage, we are going to start talking about boundaries today. And we've talked about communication and baggage and intimacy, and now we feel like the next logical step is just to talk about how we can create boundaries within our relationships in order to protect them and to protect us and hopefully set us off in a good direction going forward. And there's tons of boundaries that we can create depending on your situation, but we just want to talk about that a little bit and give you some broad strokes of what that looks like and maybe some examples as well.
And like we've done in past podcasts, especially when we're starting a new subject, it's better to define what we're talking about to make it a little more clear. So as we're looking at boundaries, we got to ask the question, what is a boundary? And I think a boundary is just a line, a limit that each partner or both partners together come to an agreement on. And they're there for our protection. They're there for accountability. They're there. You ever started a new job, and then they just shove you in there, and you don't have any idea where you're going or what you're doing? Well, a boundary kind of puts the bumpers up on the lane initially to help you keep continually moving in the right direction. I think a boundary gives you freedom too. If I have boundaries, I know how far I can go. I mean, it's really simple as Genesis 1. God said, look around, you guys. It's all yours. The only boundary is don't touch this. Don't touch this. And we always do that as human beings. Oh, don't touch the wet paint. Touch. But the boundaries were set. And so in a marriage or relationship, if we come together and negotiate some boundaries that are, good for both of us, mutually agreed upon, then it gives us a good sense of how I can navigate throughout the entirety of my marriage. So relationships are mutually defined. I said this to a wife one time, and she said, no, it's not. He defines the relationship. He's an ogre, and he's mean, he's controlling. I said, well, it's mutually defined because you are the victim. You complain and you sit back and roll over and let him do that to you. So you've done your part in defining the relationship. So boundaries are such that if a relationship is mutually defined, then there has to be mutual ownership too. And I think that's where boundaries come in. Do you have any specific, you and Katie have any specific boundaries that you've talked about, that you've set, that you've come to some mutual agreement on?
I think one that we established early on was just total openness. And with that, we don't hide things from each other. We have the ability to get into each other's passwords and emails and social networking and phones and everything like that. We don't really use that. We don't hopefully have the need to, but right. At the same time, that's something that we have the ability to do that. And then on top of that, is just being honest with each other. When there's times where I'm struggling with things or I have issues going on, I tell Katie, if she asks me a question, I don't lie about it, I got into this. It's really weird. You think lying is not a hard thing, but probably right about the time we got married, for some reason, God hit my heart with don't lie about stuff, and I realized how much I actually do lie just on little things, like when you're at work and someone asks you if something's, done and it's not quite done, but you say, yeah, it's done. And and I realized that there's just those little things. Or when someone says, how's this look on me? You may embellish a little bit or whatnot, or how are things going? Things are going good.
Yeah.
Well, no, they're not. They kind of suck right now.
Yeah.
So when we got married, God kind of hit me with, hey, don't lie just to save face. Don't lie. Don't have, as people would say, little white lies.
Yeah.
And that extended to marriage is when Katie asks me something, it's, hey, this is what it is. And regardless of the way it looks, how it feels,
Yep.
I just don't, I don't, give a white lie or anything. I just totally open and honest with her. I don't know that we said those things out loud, but they're just things that we've kind of adopted.
Yeah, and that's what happens in a relationship. You have some boundaries, and they kind of morph into different or expanded. And exactly what you said, I think it's important, especially in regards to our last podcast on intimacy. And if you're out there and you didn't hear that, you might want to go back and listen to the one before this on intimacy. So the ability to not hide or just be transparent and say how things are, those are the things that build intimacy too, this openness and freedom. So you see how they work together. And I was thinking as you talked, we've been married 41 years, and we don't get up every morning and go over the boundaries. It's just not part of our day and our daily routine, but we know they're there. And the only time a boundary is discussed is maybe when one of us or both are floating too close to the line, and maybe a rehearsal or clarification of the boundaries really become important. What about when it comes to boundaries in everyday marriage, finances, other people? Selfish endeavors. Do you guys have any spoken or unspoken boundaries there?
Yeah, I think in the last podcast I talked about how Katie wants me to eat better. Well, there's a boundary there that I'm not supposed to spend money on food, and we established that boundary, and I've gone over that boundary several times. I eat out quite consistently, and I have good months where I do, good months where I don't, and bad months where I do quite often. And so we've established those boundaries, with in regard to finances specifically, is when I eat out, I spend a couple $100 on food a month. And so she goes through and looks at the spending and says, yeah, you haven't been doing good. Yeah. You need to stop now.
That's why you use cash, Jeremy, not a debit card.
But then you get questions. Why'd you take $100 out for cash? So you have those boundaries right there.
Yeah, I know one of the. It's probably a boundary most people don't set. It's just kind of unspoken. But on your wedding day, you made a vow to be faithful and to them alone, and so that's a pretty broad range. What you didn't say is, you said I will be faithful to you and you alone. What you didn't say is I wouldn't think another female is attractive. I wouldn't not look every time a female comes in my path. I'll lower my eyes. So sometimes you need some boundaries when it comes to interaction with the opposite spouse. Again, my wife, 41 years, and I think we trust each other really to a large degree. When I was at a church and would counsel young college girls, I remember one of the guys on the board telling me I'm not allowed to do that off the campus. And I told him these girls aren't coming on the campus, so how am I to counsel them? I already had a plan in place that I talked about. My wife gave me thumbs up. She thought it was great. So I would meet at the same Starbucks not too far from the church. I knew the manager. I'd get there 10 minutes early and say, hey, so-and-so, I'm meeting this girl here. And he would. Two things happened. He said, one, I have your back, and 2, here's your free coffee, both of which I really liked. So my wife knew there was a boundary there in place for me, just not because she doesn't trust me. And sometimes boundaries aren't negative, they're positive. They're to help in self-control. They're to help in case someone else says something. So if someone would have came along and said they saw me with another girl, what's your husband doing at a Starbucks with a young college girl? My wife knew the boundaries in place, and she could spout it off better than I can. And I always had a barista to get my back.
Yeah.
Go
Well,
ahead.
and that's, that's all about the way that it looks, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So a phrase that some people may know, some people might know, is being above reproach. It's something that's thrown around in religious circles quite a bit, and it's good and it's bad. It's good because it helps protect. It's a good boundary because it helps protect your reputation.
Yeah.
It helps protect you from
Yep.
possible temptation.
Yep.
But it's basically means that, hey, you need to look right.
Yeah.
And that people don't approach you and ask you about what you were doing at a certain point because they have ideas, of what they thought happened. And that's exactly what happened there. But at the same time, it's also bad because I had a pastor who told me one time, I was about 21 and I was getting an apartment for the first time with my cousin, who's a girl. And he said, oh, hey, I don't know about you getting that apartment with your cousin. And I said, why? He's like, well, I had an apartment with my cousin when I was, or I was over at my cousin's apartment at one point, and someone saw me and they thought the worst thing. So I'm like, it's my cousin, first of all.
Correct.
Second of all, if they're thinking that,
That's just more about their
it
yeah,
does,
absolutely.
and so there you can take it too far, almost to a legalistic view where
Yeah.
you can't have contact with anyone of the opposite sex without someone else being there or whatnot, whether it be a family member or a good friend.
Yeah. Common sense has to play in this at some point. You know?
And it's Billy Graham had, we talked off air, Billy Graham had a big thing there where he would not even ride an elevator or even go on trips on his own.
He would have someone walk into his hotel room and check it out before he even walked in.
Yes, and he would go the extra length to do it. And that was a good thing to a certain respect, because if he was ever thought to have had an affair or thought to have, it would completely ruin all the work that he had done for years and years and years. So in that regard, it's a good thing that we try to set these boundaries to help out our reputation, to help out ourselves, and make sure that we're not tempted to do things. And so in marriage, I think it's good to have that boundary of hey, your wife knows where you are,
Correct, yeah.
who you're meeting with, that you have that communication, like we've talked about recently, is that there's an openness and honesty to that, and that you don't have to check in every single time with everything, but that they know what's going on, and that you have that accountability in there as well.
Which why I think it's important for couples to sit down and mutually define the boundaries. Because my wife has I believe in women's intuition and a woman's sense, and she sees certain things that I don't see, and because of that, I trust some of her, boundary suggestions. There's been a couple of times where she's come up to me and said, I would not counsel that woman if I was you. I think she saw something a little more sinister in it. And I'm just a little more naive, and I said, no, I don't think so. But I listened to her and pulled back, and sure enough, her fears were warranted with someone else. So really, that just shows you how broad boundaries are. They're wide enough to give you freedom to go back and forth, and then they're narrow enough to protect you. I don't know that I need her help in personal boundaries, and then I set some of my own. Some of our mutual ones were like revolving around our fighting style, I guess I would say. You don't raise your voice, say hurtful things, and these boundaries came like year 5 after we used to raise our voice and say hurtful things. So they came about like these aren't productive. So as you sit down and come to these mutual agreements of like when we argue, I mean, do you and Katie have any when you argue, like time limits, apology? You know, what do you guys have when it comes to your fighting style?
The one that was given to us when we were, I guess, engaged was that we don't let the argument go beyond the night. You know, you settle it. You come to a conclusion. You have some kind of resolution before you go to sleep. That one isn't always possible, and you know, honestly, we don't fight that often. I mean, we've been blessed that way, I think. You know, I can count on maybe two hands the amount of times that we've had fights in our marriage.
You must have had some good premarital counseling,
right? Thank you, Gary.
You're welcome.
No,
You're welcome.
but I don't know if it's the passive side of both of us or just the way that we work together. But we have discussions that you know aren't that bad. But we come to resolutions as well. But there's one time in particular I know we didn't come to a resolution. The next morning we got up and both felt like crap,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, later in the afternoon got together and talked and didn't like the fact that we went to bed, you know, with that anger and that frustration, and we had to resolve it there so it didn't go beyond that.
Mm-hmm. What about when it comes to, because this, I think in my counseling with young couples, this one always seems to come up. What boundary did you have in place, or were they kind of unspoken about engagement with the opposite sex? Some of it's avoidable, not avoidable. It's you have a coworker, you have and a next door neighbor. Did you guys have any hard wired boundaries when it came to interaction with the opposite sex?
I think at first no, but then it just the hard part about being 28 and getting married is you've had a good amount of time in singleness, and that was always a hard thing to get out of because. And I recently told Katie this, you know, is my standard form of communication with women was flirtatious, you know, and to stop flirting was a difficult thing, and it took me a good amount of time after we got married to stop flirting. It wasn't something that I was, you know, deceptively trying to do. It was something that was more difficult because that was just my natural inclination at that point. I had gotten so rooted in that ability or that format of communication. But after a while, you know, had to basically, you know, I even once we got married, I would tell her where I was, what I was doing, things like that. But had to even step it up even further, you know, and it wasn't something that we said. It was just something that kind of was naturally ingrained in me because of that flirtatiousness. Right. I wanted to make sure that she knew that stuff wasn't going on. Right. And so just kind of stepped it up over a little bit at a time. And that's kind of where we're at now is that, you know, we don't have to let each other know every time we're out, but you know, if there's any kind of question, you know, and I think some of that comes with, at this point, you know, you talked about it as one of the soul IDs, certainty.
Yes, yeah.
You know, is there's a little bit more certainty as you go along. I think, at least for us, that it's not something we question so much and have to check in as much anymore, because there's that certainty there that, hey, it's been 10 years. We have that certainty with each other. Agreed. A lot more than we did when, you know, necessarily when we were first married.
Yeah, I think whether it's a romantic relationship or even a family dynamic, is the more you have trust, the more you're able to expand the boundaries. I mean, you have that with your kids when they become teenagers. You know, they get the car, they don't get to drive too far, and the more trustworthy they are, the greater the expansion of their gifts and responsibilities are. What about even in this is the second thing that seems to come up in counseling with young couples, the inter-family dynamic. My wife and I had to come to a boundary that said, if it has to do with my parents, I'll do it. I'll talk to them. If it has to do with your side of the family, you're responsible. Because there was in the first few years of marriage, things she said to my mom and things that, you know, I've said to her dad really thinking I was doing the right thing, and as my wife as well. But do you guys have any inter-family dynamic boundaries?
Yeah, you know, I think that when it comes to the hard stuff, at least, it's very much that way too for us. It's you take care of your side, I'll take care of my side, and if it needs to go beyond that, we'll do it together, maybe, so that there's kind of a united front.
Yeah, yeah.
Especially once you start having kids and that comes into play, you need that even more so because when kids come into play, everyone has their own opinion of how those kids should be raised.
Yeah.
And the parents should win out. They don't always, and so you have to communicate that to grandparents. That this is what we're doing. This is what we need. You even have to introduce that to aunts and uncles too. Hey, we're not giving the kid chocolate at 3 months.
Yes.
That was my sister. Hi, Bree.
Yeah.
She did that, and we had to communicate to her, hey, hold off with the chocolate. Yeah. Katie felt a little bit more comfortable with that than necessarily my parents, but we try to handle each as it comes, and if she needs help, she comes to me, and I help her. Mm-hmm. I'm that point of contact for my family, and she's that point of contact for hers.
And that certainly makes life a little easier. I had to be. I remember it was probably during the Promise Keeper years. We were challenged as men to set for ourselves some personal boundaries. We'd kind of been talking about mutually defined boundaries, but as a man, as a husband, we were challenged to come up with some boundaries. That all seemed to, as we talked in our post-Promise Keeper groups, everybody kind of had the same set. And some that we agreed on were, I will not in public, or in private really, but certainly not in public, talk negative about my wife, bad about my wife, or use her as the butt of jokes. Because I might think it's funny, and she might even think it's funny, but I don't know what they're thinking across the table, and I want to honor and respect her that way. We had to come up with others, which were like I would never argue or contradict my wife in public, as to give the appearance that I'm right, she's always wrong, I'm intelligent, she's stupid. So as we kind of honed these personal, and by the way, let me add in there, wouldn't let someone else speak negatively or bad about my wife either. I'm not a confrontational person by nature, and I think maybe if someone would have said something harsh or critical or judgmental or even mean-spirited to her, I'm not sure at that point how I would have reacted. But as a man in a marriage, I had to say, if someone does that to her, I will step in and I'm going to say something. Those were some personal boundaries I had to set. So if you're a guy in a relationship and you haven't done that yet, I would just challenge you to work on your own personal boundaries that may honor, respect, and show intimacy, love, and connection to your wife. Make a list of those and put those in the back of your mind, and helps give you that direction and accountability that you may need.
And I'll even piggyback off that is one that I had to learn, and this was just a couple of years ago, is I, through humor, I would say things, and while I thought it was funny, I would give subtle jabs, at things, and when those jabs were, more oriented towards something my wife was doing, it was hurtful, and it's still something I have to learn to do and remember to do, but I would say, with that is as you're building those promises, those things, think about also how you can encourage and support, your wife through those things, not just, not do things, but what can you do to support, to encourage, to lift up. And that's something that I had to learn through with that, is my words needed to be more supportive than, humorous or deconstructing as they were. And she came to me at one point and told me that, and so I had to change the way that I I joked about things, and realizing that that's not something that I should joke about and that I can joke about because of the way that it makes her feel, and so that was something that instead I need to encourage and lift up and speak words that are that are better for her than propping myself up with humor.
Because we all know that in all humor there is a little bit of truth, and that's all they focus on. Let me tell you another area I think where boundaries are important in a marriage is when your kids get older and they're starting to become observant. They notice those boundaries. They really become unspoken family boundaries too. How you interact with your spouse, yelling. If there's no yelling, if there's no arguing, if there's no temper tantrums, hands on each other. Those become the unspoken boundaries for a family too. So it really does make it important. And I got to tell you, this isn't the exhaustive list of all the things about boundaries and relationship. There are some great books out there. Henry Cloud has a book called Boundaries for Marriage, and Tim Keller has a book called The Meaning of Marriage. Francis Chan has a great book, and I just can't remember the name of it. It's his marriage book. I think it's called You and Me Forever by Francis Chan. It's amazing, and you just really in a relationship you just can't read too much and get enough information. So if you don't have any boundaries, so you may be sitting there thinking, well, my wife and I don't really have boundaries. Oh, you do, but they're all unspoken. Yeah. And if they're unspoken, you really don't know how close you are to them or if you went over the line with them. So it would be helpful as you continue to grow your marriage and relationship to identify the boundaries and maybe just put them on paper and know that they're there. Again, we don't have to refer to them every week. They're beneficial for not only you as an individual, but for both of you as a couple.
Well, and I think not only are books helpful in that, but finding someone else who's been through it.
Yeah.
Great kind of like a mentorship for your marriage.
Great point. Yeah.
And that's kind of where you can get another perspective. Mm-hmm. People that have been through it can tell you what boundaries you need to maybe instill, maybe places where they had trouble, places that they needed to set boundaries. Yep. That'll help you also figure out boundaries that maybe you haven't thought of, maybe you haven't even perceived as being an issue, and it helps you get ahead of the game a little bit.
True. What I do in premarital counseling is if it's a young couple, I like to hook them up with a mentor couple. Part of the problem is, so when you and your young spouse fight and the girl will go home and tell her mom how mean you were, and then you come back that night and you've made up and everything's happy, but mom's back at home sticking a pin in the son-in-law doll. And so you try to help them as well. And you find, I love your point. You find a mentor couple who's been there, gone through it, and can show you, I wouldn't go not that door, take door number 2. It's vital in speeding up the progress in a young marriage.
And I'd say this also goes beyond marriage too. If you're single, if you're in a dating relationship, finding someone to mentor you through that and identify the boundaries that help them as well, whether it be in your relationship or just in being single and in a potential relationship, or while you're in that season of being single, it's a good thing to have someone come alongside you and help you identify the boundaries that you need to place in your own life, so that you can have a fruitful relationship in the future.
That's such a great point. We say that we want to make sure that we don't exclude singles or singleness in this series that we're doing, and I think that's where personal boundaries come into place. You ought to have some. It's funny because I didn't realize they were boundaries. I would have this exercise where I would tell people to define and create their own personal manifesto, but all that is simply writing their boundaries. So if I'm single and I know what I want, then I have to have some boundaries. You know what? I want a good wife. Probably not going to find her in a place of ill repute. I want someone that has a spiritual background. Probably not going to find that at the Church of Satan. There's certain obvious things that we need to write down, but when you write them down, they become real. So if you're out there and you're single, there's nothing wrong with even now developing these personal boundaries that will absolutely integrate into a relationship when and if you get one.
Well, and to even take it a step further, and I am the person who should not be talking about this, but it's kind of like if you're trying to lose weight. You can say all you want. Oh, I want to weigh XXX amount of.
Yeah.
I was going to do 3 X's there, but I realized that would be so 4 X's would be like 1,000 pounds, I guess. But I want to weigh ABC. Let's put it that way.
Correct. That's better.
You set out a plan. You set out boundaries of what you're going to eat, what you're not going to eat, when you're going to lift, when you're not going to lift, when you're going to exercise, when you're going to sleep. All those things are important components to having a healthy lifestyle and losing that weight.
Yeah.
If you go out and you just say, I want to weigh ABC, and then you don't set a plan and you freelance it like I do, you end up at Whataburger on a Wednesday, and Thursday and Friday, and you don't see the necessary change that you want to see, and you have a harder time reaching your goals. And so I think in that way, it's good to have boundaries because it's a plan, it's a guideline, it's a blueprint. Do you have to necessarily stick with them 100% or throw away the plan? No. You may stray outside of it, but you know how to get back on the path. And so when you get back on the path, then you're in your plan again, and you're going. And so that's important, is that you have that plan. Not just in your head, write it down, visualize it, physically, tangibly visualize it, and be able to know how to get back on pace and in step with what you need to be doing.
No, that's a great point. And in future podcasts, we'll be talking about, conflict resolution and so forth, and how you negotiate and navigate that in a relationship. But the key is exactly what you said. If I have some boundaries, now I have a place to go back to and start again. So that's a great point. So as we come to the end of another podcast, in our attempt to not just be informational, but to give you something tangible as a takeaway, we kind of discussed them throughout the podcast, but sit down with your significant other, your wife, your spouse, your girlfriend, and identify, first of all, if you have unspoken boundaries, and if you do, let's write them down, which ones are realistic, which ones aren't. And then develop a few boundaries as far when it comes to finances, when it comes to your fighting style, when it comes to other people, the 3 or 4 major topics. Write them down, and that becomes now your foundation for moving on. And then each one of you, female and male, take a moment and write down your personal boundaries that you are holding yourself accountable to. And when you do that, it certainly keeps you centered as we go through this journey of marriage.
I think one last thing that's important to say is, I kind of threw out there that when you're single, you can kind of cross the boundaries and get back on the path. When you're married, that's a little bit more difficult. If you cross certain boundaries, it's hard to get back on the path. So the boundaries that you set, make sure that you are staying in line with, that you're within the boundaries, and that you're not outside of them considerably. But writing those down, discussing them, communicating, setting those expectations, those roles, those boundaries, that is all important in a marriage, in a relationship. So we do really encourage you to do that. And, as I sit here and think, maybe that's something that we need to sit back down and do and make sure that we are doing that. And through that, the intimacy becomes better.
Absolutely.
You've concluded these things together, and you learn what the other person needs a little bit more from you through these boundaries, how to encourage them better, how to love them better, how to give them certainty better, all those soul ideas.
Yeah.
So I encourage you to do that, and that hopefully this podcast has been something that helps you out with that. And so as we do that, if you need any help doing that, any feedback for us, any questions for us on how to do that, you can do that in a couple different places. You can reach out to us through all of our social media platforms, Facebook, .com/RP podcast. Also on Instagram at RP podcast, and then Twitter at the RP podcast. You can reach out to us any of those places or on our website at rppodcast.com and ask questions, and we can get you information, and we can help out with creating those boundaries. And you can reach out to us in any of those ways. We are so thankful that you're listening today, and hopefully that you enjoyed it, that you got something out of it, and I know we did as well. So thank you again for listening, and we will see you next time.